Plant pathology. Which, if we could phrase the first part this way, it isn't always disease. We get all excited. It's plant pathology. We get excited about diseases. We have to restrain ourselves sometimes. But it's also easy to lose perspective that it's not always a disease that's causing the problems you see. And one very large group of problems with our plants that are not disease are what we call the abiotic disorders. That comes from A, meaning not, biotic, meaning living. So these are non-infectious, that would be another way to say it. So they're not going to be contagious from one plant to another, but the symptoms that they cause can be similar to those caused by plant diseases, so they can create some confusion. So what kind of abiotic problems are we talking about? Things like drought, things like flooding, nutrient deficiencies, vice versa, excess fertilizer, soil conditions, pesticide, air pollution, and temperature extremes. What would be the most extreme temperature extreme? How about light? So, lightning damage. So all these things are abiotic factors. And one that's, well, you wouldn't consider abiotic, but you'll notice that some of these things are, shall we say, under the management of the gardener. So I like to tell, even though it's biotic, I like to tell the students the most dangerous organism for our plants is Homo sapiens. This slide, some information from our turf grass diagnostician Lee Butler. I don't handle the turf, so I don't know that much about it, but I know a lot of people are interested in it, and I included a slide or two about those. So shade, excess shade for the species of grass, right? Drainage, improper mowing height or mowing frequency, inadequate fertilization, and poor adaptation. So as you know, here in central North Carolina, we're kind of in the uncomfortable middle ground between where the warm season grasses do well and where the cool season grasses do well. So neither one is quite happy here. There's some clues when you're looking at whether a problem is caused by a disease or some abiotic factor. One of them would be the percentage affected. If it's 100%, right, in a short period of time, diseases don't do that. Very few insects could. You know, we had this problem with armyworms earlier this fall. So that would be sort of an exception. But a high percentage affected, also the pattern in the landscape, uniformity. So when you see these dead trees and shrubs all along the right-of-way, that was what herbicide spraying by the Department of Transportation. The pattern on the plant can also be a clue, and the number of species affected. So if you see that many different kinds of plants are having these symptoms, unrelated plants, then that's also a clue that it probably isn't a disease or pest, because they tend to be more specific. A couple examples of abiotic problems, of course, blossom end rot on tomato, where there's a deficiency of calcium in the developing fruit, and you get the decay at the blossom end. That's the name. Here's one where we suspected iron chlorosis. So the newer foliage being yellow color, call that chlorosis. And in this case, the soil pH where that oak was growing was 7.5. High pH ties up the iron, even though it's in the soil, it can't be taken up by the plant, and you get iron deficiency symptoms. This was at the home of our late friend and colleague, Dr. Chuck Hodges, here in Raleigh. He had a problem with these Japanese hollies, and it turns out that the soil was hydrophobic. So water, instead of actually soaking into the root ball, was channeling around it or through it, and plus the fact that the high salts were accumulating probably because of insufficient drainage, and he lost a couple of plantings, I think, of Japanese holly in front of his. All right, email from April 19th, 2021. How about this is redacted. I live in Mecklenburg County. I was hoping this is the correct address to professional credit plant disease. My customer has some shrubs that were pruned extremely low last year by the previous owner, and the shoots that came up to turn black recently. I'm not sure the type of shrub this is either, and I've attached some pictures to this email best. Look at the date. Yeah, this is frost. So that a few days earlier, there was a freeze at the in Mecklenburg County, Wake County also, and the fact that they pruned them hard. Well, that's sometimes a problem because you prune hard too late in the season, and this flush of tender growth comes out, and then the first frost of that. But this is, of course, the new growth that season that was affected. All right, another abiotic situation. Here are also some camellia blossoms that got frosted. And I include this picture so that you can mentally compare it to a later one that I'll show of an actual disease on camellia blossoms. Cold injury is an interesting situation though, not just frost injury, cold injury. So when I first started in the clinic back in the late 90s, and Tom Kressel was, he's not at Purdue, but was the director of the clinic, diagnosing cold injury in August. What? What's going on? Well, what happens is the base of the main stem of a shrub in this case is the last part to go dormant in the fall for the winter and the first part to become active in the spring. So that is going to be most susceptible to your early freezes or your late freezes. So you get damage to the bark can split, it can be lost as you see here on the center photograph and the right photograph. But the symptoms on the foliage don't show up until the hot, stressful weather comes. And then the plant isn't able to move enough water into the foliage. So we're seeing the symptoms in maybe July and August, but the damage occurred back in the late fall or early spring. On the other end of the spectrum, we can get direct heat and drought stress. So this was 2010. We had a very dry period that summer, and you can see these blotches that you would say, oh, it looks like a disease on the sycamore, all the leaves falling off, heat and drought stress. Some things, again, can get confusing between abiotic and biotic problems. So that scorch or marginal burn on the dogwood there was from the heat and drought that same summer. But this dogwood here looks like it kind of has a wilted, modelly looking unhappiness to it. Anybody know what that is? Powdery mildew. So with dogwood, sometimes you have to actually hold the leaf up to the light at an angle and see that the powdery mildew is there, and that is causing also the symptom of the kind of blotchiness there. All right, one more example of scorch due to heat and drought on the one hand versus a disease on the other. Do you know what that one is? Bacterial leaf scorch. All right. Another aspect of the abiotic environment of a plant would be the moisture conditions. And this was a planting, it still is, of hellebores there on campus, just outside the clinic door practically. And you notice that they're not very happy on the left side, they're very happy on the right. What it was there's a moisture gradient there. So it stays wetter on the left. Since hellebore doesn't like wet feet, that is probably why you get this. I'm sure this will come up in the diagnostics, but what's this? And why is the foliage turning yellow at the base of the leaflets there? Bright yellow, almost a bleached looking at the base of the leaflets in the tomato. This is one of the cases you can actually diagnose this with yourself. Most of the time with herbicide injury, we say, well, let the professional say it, but in this case, you can diagnose this. That is glyphosate injury. Tomato is very sensitive to glyphosate. So herbicides with that product, if there's drift on there, that can cause this symptom. So that's pretty diagnostic. So this is one of our biggest abiotic factors affecting the plants in the landscape and the garden. So glyphosate in this case, on tomato, easy to diagnose. In others, it's a little bit harder. But these are our three main suspects for home landscapes when it comes to herbicide damage. Besides glyphosate, the ALS inhibitors, so like imazepate and some others. And you have to be careful now because there is a common brand name of herbicide that used to only be glyphosate, but now there are different variations of it that come mixed with some of these other products, and you have to be more careful with them because some of them are more likely to be picked up by roots as well. And triclopyr, so she mentioned triclopyr, that is in our third group here, the synthetic auxins, or the 2,4-D type herbicides. So these are the three groups most often used by the public that would tend to cause damage when misused. An investigative process So one of the most obvious would be, right, you're spraying, it's breezy, and the spray drift hits the foliage or maybe some green bark there and it's absorbed. Another thing is that if someone's using a herbicide in a sprayer and then they think they've washed it all out and they go use it for, you know, insecticide or fungicide, there can be carryover that way. Third would be leaching into the soil. That's where some of these ALS are the problem. The A is starting to come to be as subtle something. I don't know. But yeah, some of those, they get leached into the soil and then picked up by the roots and cause damage. This could be that on the right here, where you get these clusters of buds breaking out on the bark of, this is crepe myrtle. You'll see it, ligustrum is also quite sensitive. Residues overwintering in wood or bark, so an exposure, you know, late summer can show up as symptoms the following year, and then as you said, the carryovers in mulch and manure. Planting too deeply. How do we know this was planted too deeply?
There's no root flare.
Yeah.
No root flare. Looks like a telephone pole just set into the ground there, right? One of the reasons this can become problematic, well, here, another example first, multiple injuries, right? So the plant was just stuck in the hole there, the roots got turned upward, and then later someone got it with a weed trimmer. This was a sample sent into the clinic, right? So, you know, pot mound in the nursery, trying to avoid that, but there are things that you can do to remediate before you plant if you do have some circling roots here. I blanked out the name of the restaurant. You won't guess which one it is.
Yeah.
So take a close look at the base of this maple tree, and you can see some of these girdling roots there. So if you plant too deeply, this is one of the dangers, or mulch too deeply, is that if there are roots that are growing out tangential instead of radially outward, they can eventually, as they increase in girth, and the trunk does as well, they can kind of strangle the growth of the plant. That tree is gone, and last I saw, it was astroturf. So this would be proper mulching. So you want the mulch around to retain moisture, the soil from getting too hot around the roots, not have the competition with the grass, and you want to have that zone free of mulch right around the base of the trunk. Any questions about the abiotic disorders? Part two, sometimes it is disease. But before we talk about disease, let's talk about the biotic factors in general. So the living things that cause damage to our plants. Genetic abnormalities within the plant itself. Things like chimeras and fasciation and so forth. Insects and mites, which we're going to talk about later. You haven't had those yet, right? Vertebrate pests. So sapsuckers, voles, rabbits, deer, etc. And then plant pathogens, which is what we'll be talking about here. By pathogen, what is a pathogen? Anybody have their own definition of that?
Something like causes disease.
Yeah, it's just, I would say, microorganisms capable of causing disease. We'll talk about, well, how does that work, but later. This slide is really important. When you're learning about a new disease, there are some things you should ask first. Don't jump to, what do I do to control it? Or worse yet, what do I spray? I'm sure you'll get that a lot as you become master gardener. What do I spray? But there's some questions you want to ask first to understand the situation and how to manage it. First one is, do I really know what I have? Now you're going to have a diagnostics course in a little bit, but you may want to ask the further question, does it need laboratory confirmation to be sure that I have X? What hosts are affected? Is what I have on my rose only going to affect roses, or is it going to affect possibly other plants? What's the damage potential? Is this something that's just cosmetic? It's not going to really affect the long-term survival of this plant? Or is it something that could potentially cause great damage and even the death of the specimen? Another question before you ask, what can I do? Is it too late? Now, I don't mean just, is it too late to save the plant, but maybe in the season, there are times where an intervention will help reduce the amount of disease, but then after a certain point, let's say we'll have an example of this later, the pathogen is no longer active, so there's no point in doing anything, for this year at least. What conditions or seasons are favorable? A little bit of the flip side of that previous question. So maybe it's been dry, maybe it's been rainy, maybe that's changed. We'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the disease triangle. Also, how does this pathogen survive unfavorable conditions? It's the winter. It's very dry. It doesn't have a host. Where is it? How is it surviving? Some of them will survive in the soil, right? Some of them will survive in plants in our landscapes, on the trees, and cankers and so forth. Some of them don't. Some of them, like downy mildew on cucurbits, will only get here every year, usually late May into June, from the south. It can overwinter in Florida, but not here. So think about, where is it coming from? Or how does it survive? And how does it get around? So is it windblown? Is it carried by water? Is it carried by some kind of a vector, insect or mite, for example? So these are the questions if you want to know to really understand a new disease that you're learning about before you get to the next question of, do I need to do anything? If so, what? One helpful generality is that diseases in plants tend to run in families. So if you have a plant that you don't know anything about its diseases, if you know what family it is, then you've got at least a start, but it's not 100%. So for example, fire blight. How many of you have seen fire blight? We had a lot of it this year. All right, terrible on pears, can be bad on apples. It can get on Cotoneaster, where I'm from, and get on mountain ash, which is not ash, it's actually rosacea. But it doesn't get on stone fruits. So if you see peach, no, that's not fire blight. So it tends to run in families, but it's not 100%. And I don't worry about trying to remember this. I actually think we have this on our website under problems with Cupressaceae. So some things like Phytophthora root rot are across the board in the family, arborvitaes and leylands and junipers, not eastern red cedar, but other junipers, whereas some are more specific. So Ceridium canker, we would only see that on leyland, rust, we would only see that on the juniper. So if you have, for example, an arborvitae, don't bring us an arborvitae and say, I think I have passel or needle blight. I think we maybe seen this once, maybe, or rust. So again, tend to run in families, but it's not 100%. Going to the question of what's the damage potential, not all diseases are created equal. So I put together this graphic for, it applies to woody ornamentals in the landscape. Generally speaking, the least serious ones are the leaf spot and powdery mildew diseases, especially on our deciduous trees. Why? The leaves will be gone anyway. Now there are a few exceptions. All right, so Entomosporium leaf spot on red tip Photinian, in hawthorn, boxwood blight, those are pretty serious leaf diseases. But in general, then more serious would be the canker diseases, where you have the potential to lose entire stems or limbs, or if it's in the trunk, the whole thing. More serious yet would be the root rots, which can not only kill the plant, but persist in the soil, depending on the pathogen, how long. And I would consider the vascular wilts to be the most serious. So things like Dutch elm disease, laurel wilt, now vascular streak dieback. So these are the ones where the actual plumbing of the plant is being affected by the presence of the pathogen, and so you can get wilting and sometimes very quick demise. So let's take a break, but we're not going to. Part 3, the perpetrators. So plant pathogens and the disease triangle. Many of my colleagues would start out their talk about plant pathology with the disease triangle, but I tend to put it a little bit later in the explanation. The first with the pathogen part of it. But these are our big four. These are the four major groups of plant pathogens, and we'll go through them one by one. So fungi are number one in terms of the number of species that cause disease on plants, the number of plant diseases caused by fungi. And when we get into things like turf grasses or trees, then fungi way outnumber the other groups. What is a fungus? Well, it has certain characteristics. The actual body or growing portion of it is composed of microscopic threads. These threads, well, one would be called the hypha, plural would be hyphae. And if they're together in a mass that you can see, we call it mycelium. They have absorptive nutrition, so they are exuding enzymes through their cell walls, breaking down the material around them, and then absorbing those nutrients back into their cells. So they're not eating in the sense that animals do. Some are parasites. So some of them are deriving their nutrition from other living organisms, but not all. We'll talk about that. All of them, by the way, are heterotrophs. You heard the term heterotrophs? I don't put it up here. They can't make their own food, right? So they have no chlorophyll. One time, oh, this is years ago now, Tom Volk, I think it was, who was, I'm not sure where he is now, he was up at the University of Wisconsin, La Crosse. He put out an April Fool's thing. If they had found some kind of missing link between fungi and plants, and it was had chlorophyll and was found in a kangaroo pouch and so forth. Another characteristic of fungi is that they reproduce by spores, and those spores may be produced by either mitosis or meiosis, or flip it around, meiosis or mitosis. They can be either sexual or asexual spores. Here's an example of a microscopic view of the fungus that causes daylily leaf streak, and you can see all the spores they're producing. And I didn't mention it, but that at the bottom there, those are hyphae of the fungus Rhizoctonia, or a Rhizoctonia-like fungus, and you can see the kind of branching structure and the filamentous nature of it. When you have, not the microscopes that we have here today, who was it who said that we didn't look at spores? So, yeah, sorry. So we don't have enough power on these to actually see these kind of things, but that's one of the nice things about my work is we have, I'll have our compound scopes as well as our dissecting scopes, and we can see cool stuff like this. And even very occasionally things like that. So fungi take the cake. Again, they are the biggest section or segment of our plant pathogen, excuse me, concerns. I would put bacteria and viruses kind of behind them, nematodes behind that, but it depends on the situation. Fungi cause lots of different kinds of problems. Don't worry about remembering this whole list, but just be aware that they can do a lot of different kinds of damage. Everything from leaf spots, blights, wilts, different kinds of rots, either roots, fruits, or crowns. Roots and fruits, we'll just stick with that. Cankers and galls, powdery mildews, downy mildews, rust, and decay of wood. I predict that when they come to the diagnostic portion of the course, they will differentiate between symptoms and something. Just suffice it to say for now that the sign is when you actually see the organism that's causing the problem. With fungi, when they're causing a plant disease, you may or may not actually see it. And we'll show examples here of some cases where you can. Now, I've been saying fungi, but some people would say, don't call all of them fungi. I think that ecologically, when you deal with a homeowner especially, it's okay. But really, we're putting under this umbrella two different groups. One are properly called the oomycetes. So things like late blight, the organism that causes late blight, Phytophthora, Pythium, and the downy mildews. So that's an example on slide here, photo A there of downy mildew on rose. as distinguished from the true fungi, examples being early blight, black spot, picture B, Cercospora leaf spot, picture C, the rust, armillaria root rot. And they look kind of similar, right? There's just two examples. You wouldn't necessarily say growing on a petri plate that they're different, and they do have mycelium, they reproduce by spores and so forth. But on an evolutionary scale or phylogenetically, the one on the right is actually more closely related to a cow than it is to the one on the left. All right? So they're a completely different kingdom. Yep. So that's fungi. Bacteria. Again, as you got from the matching question there, they are single-celled. There are individual bacteria under the microscope. I don't very often look at them like individually. Sometimes we look for bacterial streaming coming out of tissue, but it's not one where I identify them because I can see any kind of particular characteristics there. We use other techniques like what they look like on the colony plates and biochemical reactions and so forth. This would be a colony of many millions of bacteria growing on that petri dish. And they cause also a wide variety of plant diseases. Some of them will cause leaf spots, also wilts and blight. So the tomato there has southern bacterial wilt, which is a very serious disease, and you're likely to have gardeners come in from time to time, especially on tomato. There are bacterial rots of stems, tubers, crowns, and fruit, but not root rot. So you won't see bacteria causing root rot unless it's, let's say, a really advanced stage of that bacterial wilt. And some of them cause galls. So crown gall, for example, on this grapevine on the right, that's caused by a bacterium. You won't likely see any kind of sign of the bacteria themselves, though. Very rare exceptions where you actually see some ooze on the material as it's in the landscape or the orchard or whatever. Viruses. The viruses, these are submicroscopic, right? So we're never going to see them even with the nice microscopes that we have in the clinic. And they're so simple that they need a living host cell in order to reproduce. So they can only reproduce if they have that. In plants, viruses are incurable. So a person can get over a viral infection. A plant cannot. And that's going to be important when we talk about management. I have a plant that's got a virus. Yep, either live with it, which in many cases it's not causing any serious damage. If it is, submicroscopic, as I said, so we won't be able to see them. So how do we diagnose them? Well, we have techniques, microlysis and immunostrips. Everybody knows these kind of tests now with the home COVID test, same principle. They too cause a wide range of symptoms. So you see the spots here, the kind of circular spots on the tomatoes and the leaf in the center there, leaf malformations, some flower break, etc. Viruses, because of their simple nature, they need help. And to get from plant to plant, one of the ways for a few of them, like tomato mosaic virus, tobacco mosaic virus, hosta virus X, is by mechanical transmission. Right? You're handling this tomato and you go and handle this tomato. You're coming through the weed eater on your hosta bed, then you move over to this part of it here, you can spread it around. Those are the minority though. Insects are more important. So aphids and thrips, especially, those are just two examples there. Tomato spotted wilt virus is a very big problem in not only tomatoes, but a large number of plants, a wide range of plants, brought in from the weeds into the garden by thrips. Very small insects. They're not that big. They are that big. Mites. So rose rosette is transmitted by an aerophyte mite that you wouldn't even see with your hand. They're so small. I don't have a picture. Matt has a great picture of an aerophyte mite next to a spider mite, and it could sit on the leg of the spider mite.
Wow.
It's like the size of a spider mite leg. There are some that are transmitted by nematodes. So this is an exception to what I said about not surviving in the soil. There are some that, because they can also exist in a nematode vector, if you remove the plant and plant another one, you could have that happen. So tobacco rattle virus and peony would be a case of that. Yeah, there's another group of exceptions, but not worth mentioning. So that brings us to nematodes or nematodes, depending on where you grew up. So they are microscopic roundworms. Most of them are free living, so they're not actually parasites at all. They're feeding on bacteria in the soil, fungi in the soil. Actually, most species are marine. So apparently there even have made appearances on SpongeBob. I don't think they've actually behaved the way they're depicted there, but yeah, most are marine. So, and of course, they're animal parasites as well, right? From our dogs and cats and so forth. In the case of those that do feed on plants, most of them are in the roots. Most of them are going to be root feeders. A couple of important exceptions. They may either feed internally inside the root or just externally. And here's a case of one of the internal endoparasitic nematodes, we call them, the root knot nematode, where that female becomes basically an egg factory. Looks like a little pear-shaped thing you can see under the microscope.
Parts in the middle one.
What's that?
Want to find out the mouth parts in the middle one? Mouthful.
Well, they wouldn't have mouth parts in the sense that an insect would, but they do have what's called a stylet, a little piercing structure there that uses to break into the plant cell. But so do the fungi feeding nematodes. But if it doesn't have a stylet, then it's not a plant parasite. All right, above symptoms, nematodes. Stunting or lack of vigor, right? Because the roots are compromised. The leaves may have some bronzing or yellowing to them. Wilting of the plant, general decline, dieback death. This unhappy children. This picture in the lower right, I think this was, it was something, no, I think it was a different case, but it was with impatiens, as I recall. A golf course, which had some of their landscape where they had impatiens, patients and begonias tend to get bad. And they had this fungicide program, right? They're doing all these sprays and drenches and so forth. They still had plants dying while they had nematodes in the soil. One interesting thing about any soil-borne pathogen, including nematodes, is that the distribution tends to be patchy. So you'll have higher concentrations here and lower here and so forth. So kind of a patchy or spotty. In turf grass, that means an irregular stand symptom, but we haven't talked about what are called the stand symptoms in turf. Once you look below ground, you may see a stunted root system, lesions on the roots. So down in the lower right here, you can see an example of that. Disease on the left, healthy on the right. And most famously, galls or knots on the root. Not every nematode causes galling in the root systems. It just happens that some of our most important ones in North Carolina do.
Are there any beneficial nematodes?
Yes. There are even nematodes that are used as biocontrol agents against, let's say, insects in the greenhouse that will attack the fungus gnats. You wouldn't know that that plant on the right had nematodes if you didn't see it compared to the growth of the one on the left that doesn't. But the question is, why in sandy soils would they cause more damage? They probably can move around more easily. What else? Sandy soils retain less water and less nutrients. And when your roots are compromised, that's where you're hurting, right? You're not able to move those nutrients that are there. So when there are fewer, you're going to be more susceptible to symptomatic results. All right, now finally, we're going to talk about the disease triangle, which we'll start with these kind of talks. We've already introduced some of the players. We need a pathogen in order to have disease. That's a disease-causing agent, right? We've already talked about the 4 different main groups of plant pathogens. We also need a susceptible host, so the plant on which it's going to occur. True or false? It takes 2 to tango. It takes 3. Why does it take 3? You've got to have music. You can have two dancers, but if there's no music, there's no tango. And so the third, I can see you've read your chapter. The third element here is the favorable environment for the development of disease. And there's a fourth factor, if you want, which is that it occurs over time. Right? So these are not instantaneous changes like you could get with a lightning strike or insect feeding and so forth. So talking about the environment a little bit. Oftentimes it's a wet environment, excess moisture that is favorable to diseases. For example, our bacterial leaf spots and fungal leaf spots, Phytophthora and Pythium. Do you remember what group those fall under, those pathogens? They're fungi, but they're oomycetes. Within the oomycetes, the two big groups of plant pathogens are the downy mildews and these, which are called water molds. They're called water molds for a reason, right? Excess moisture favors them, and I think I have a little movie actually coming up here. Those would be examples of a favorable environment being wet, but sometimes the favorable environment is actually the opposite. It's when it's hot or dry. So you can have drought conditions that predispose plants to later either infection or disease expression, so such as Bischinosia, a fungus on our oaks, or Botrytis canker. And sometimes, like I gave with the example of cold injury, but it also applies to things like root rots, it's stress that may trigger the symptoms. The infection occurred when everything was wet, but now it's dry, plant's roots are rotting, so what's going to happen? Temperature also can be important, and so let me see. I actually have a better example of these in a moment. Again, excess moisture often favors plant disease development. On the left there, that's Acidovorax bacterial leaf spot on some Dusty Miller in the greenhouse, and there's Dusty Miller in the landscape that had, I think it had Pythium and maybe Phytophthora. It had multiple different diseases there at the roots on that Dusty Miller. As far as temperature, some things like it hot. Southern stem blight used to be called Sclerotium ralphsii, and then they renamed it. Well, no, they just used one of the other names, and now they renamed it. We just call it southern stem blight. You won't see that around here before mid-May. Whereas in the winter months, early spring, you may see Sclerotinia blight. So different temperatures, different fungi are going to be happening. Sometimes it's more complicated than that, though. Sometimes it's not so much what the pathogen likes, it's what the plant doesn't like. This disease here is called large patch. The Butler, again, the turf diagnostician provided this image. Large patch is a disease of warm season turf species when they're under stress in cool weather. So the turf is not in the time of year when it's happiest, and this is when the disease does its damage. Versus, and it happens to be also a Rhizoctonia, the fungus, but a brown patch on things like tall fescue is going to occur in the summer months when the cool season grass is now starting to get under stress. So that's our second point of the triangle there about or third, the environmental conditions, how they affect. It already came up before the question of, no, I brought it up. That wasn't the question. How do these things survive adversity? By adversity, I mean there's no host plant or the conditions are unfavorable, right? Extreme cold, winter, and so forth. Well, there's three main strategies. One is, okay, I'm going to survive on I'm going to find a living plant somewhere to survive on. That could be in the weeds. There's no garden right now, but hey, there's perennial weeds around. So the example that I gave was tomato spotted wilt virus. That's where it hangs out, and the thrips vectors bring it in to the garden in the spring. It may actually overwinter on in the buds, and I'll show an example of one of those, or in cankers, in the fire blight example, right? The organism is in there in the living tissue of a woody plant and surviving there. Strategy number two is just tough it out and form some kind of a resistant structure that can survive in the soil and survive the cold and the desiccation and so forth, either as some kind of a resting spore, like the one of the fungus that causes the black root rot there in the lower left. We used to call it Flaviopsis, now it's called the Kelliomyces. Just saw a case of that yesterday, came to the clinic from our greenhouse. It could be in the form of sclerotia. So that's where remember the hyphae of the fungus are those threaded, basically the threaded body of it. But sometimes they will basically ball up and form a resistant structure with a kind of hardened surface to it and survive that way. So that's the one for the southern stem blight fungus there. And in the case of nematodes, they can survive like the root knot nematode as egg masses in the soil. And the third option would be on dead plant material. So that's what we call our saprobic lifestyles. These are the ones that, all right, I don't have a living plant, but I can still work on this material that's dead and still derive nutrition from it. Not every plant pathogen can do that. Some of them are what we call obligate parasites. They have to have a living host, viruses, for example. But there are many fungi and bacteria that will stay on the dead material, either leaves on the ground, in your compost pile, don't put disease plant in your compost pile. I'm sure not getting hot enough to kill them. And that's how they would survive from one year to the next. So I promised to talk about Camellia petal blight. This is very clear, unless it's on your community. The timing of the fungus life cycle is coordinated with the plant's bloom cycle. So the fungus will infect the blossom. It looks a little bit different from the frost damage that I showed in one of those first slides. But you can also tell, in most cases, by pulling the base of the blossom off and seeing a little ring of mycelium here of the fungus that cause the blossom to rot and fall off. What happens then? The blossom decays away, but that fungus forms a sclerotium there that just sits and waits all summer and waits all winter. And in the spring, it produces a tiny, you have to actually be looking for it, know what you're looking for. But a very tiny little mushroom-like structure that produces the spores that are then blown up and infect the blossoms. And it does it at the same time that the shrub is blossoming. The other thing you can do is late winter, just add that inch or two of mulch on there. So that if there are any sclerotia that you didn't get, that the spores aren't going to reach the air currents and be distributed. Which brings on, now these are not data, right? This is just a graphic to illustrate the two tendencies. So some pathogens that are able to survive are what we call soil invaders. They are only there for as long as it takes for the plant material to break down. And then their populations are so low, we don't have to worry about it. Can you see okay? Am I watching? Others are soil inhabitants, which are going to then, once they're there, they're going to be there. Why is this important? Put it this way, which one or which group will rotation be an effective strategy against? The invaders. So if you have a situation where let's say bacterial spot on tomato, you know that once the tomato foliage and so forth is all broken down, that bacterium is going to die out. So you can not grow tomato for a few years and then come back and it won't be there. If you've got southern bacterial wilt, that's a soil invader. And indefinitely in the future, if you put tomato there, it's going to be at risk.
That's a soil inhabitant.
It is a soil inhabitant. So moving from the survival to the dispersal. So how do they get around? Here's an example with the fungi. What would be the difference between how the spores on the left versus the spores on the right get around? One that's produced in a drop of liquid will be dispersed how? Could be rain, other kind of water splash. would be insects, right? The sticky material sticks to an insect body and then it carries it somewhere. But not likely floating around on the wind. An example, not as extreme of actually a drop of liquid like that, but where spores stick together. Someone mentioned boxwood blight earlier. So that one has spores that do have a mucilage around them and they don't get picked up by wind currents. So that's going to be more important. Things like rain splash, possibly people working in infected areas and on their clothing or equipment, or that we had cases where apparently it was being moved around on the burlap sacks that folks were using to collect the tips, you know, for growing, the folks who grow boxwoods for Christmas wreaths and things like that, and the folks who were going to harvest the tips and then to make into the holiday greenery arrangements were possibly spreading it around on there. I don't know if there's ever proven that that was suspected. On the other hand, you can have, especially with the fungi, some that produce very dry spores and that are carried by the wind and get around that way. So powdery mildew, the example on the right here, under the microscope, it just produces these dry chains of spores that will be picked up by wind currents and spread that way. Remember when I talked about the water molds, Phytophthora and Pythium? They're kind of interesting and unique in this way that they produce zoospores, so swimming spores. Let's see, there's one right there. Right? You can see the sporangium that produces, well, I don't think that came from that one, but you can see an empty sporangium there in the center of the field where it was produced. So these can get around for at least short distances in, there's a bunch of them. They can get around for these short distances in the water and find the plant root, and they'll be attracted to the chemicals produced by the plant roots. But for long distance transport, what they need is the water to be moving them across the landscape or moving soil. Just move soil and you're going to move just about anything. Four main categories then of dissemination or dispersal of our plant pathogens. Water, talked about, wind, insect and mite vectors, and what was the fourth one we talked about? Yeah. People, tools, vehicles, stuff that we do. So anytime you move soil, and anytime you move live plants or plant parts, you could be moving pathogens. I don't know if you're aware of how much the nursery and greenhouse industry depends on long distance transport of planting material. Cuttings produced overseas that are brought in and then rooted out here for sale. Plants that are produced on the West Coast in nurseries there and then shipped across the country. And we've had some cases where very serious plant pathogen has been moved to sites across the country in that way. So just be aware of that. I know it's hard, but when you're talking to in my case, my sister-in-law, right? And she wants to give you a plant from her garden. It's like, I love you, but no, anyway. Then it may or may not actually end up in our yard. I show the fig example here because that's you may have seen people do air layering of figs when you on the branch you get it to root out. So figs tend to have one of the diseases they get as a virus, and so that nice rooted plant that they then take home with them, they're taking the virus to. Oh, and these cuttings of the liripe there that had at least it had root knot nematodes, and maybe it had some other things on there. I one time, I don't want to spend the whole time on anecdotes and things, but there was a company that I mail ordered some seed from of some kind of, not called heirloom, there's another name that they had. One was from some squash. It's called PPN squash, and here it's called, I don't remember the name. But it's my wife is from Mexico, and it's one that they have there. So I ordered some seed from that, and I still have, like years later, I'm still growing from that same seed over and over again. But I also got some beans, and those beans had, they did appear to have virus. So sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. We talked earlier about a gradient of the seriousness of diseases, right? So we had the leaf spots and then the cankers and the root rots and the vascular. But another way to look at it is that they're not all equal in terms of where the infection occurs. So you can have, on the one hand, a localized infection where that spot on the leaf or those roots, that stem is infected and it goes no further, versus a systemic infection. So like a vascular wilt, touch-on disease, so forth, or viruses, which are going to be systemic in the plant, where they're throughout the whole thing. And I'll show another example later of another one. How much is colonized? So be careful too. There's a nice canker there you can prune out. But, so I cut that off. Landscape people didn't see me. And you'll notice that I got well below where you would have symptomatic foliage. But if I look at the cut end, so I'm not sure if that's the same thing that was causing the dieback there, a fire, but you do have to think about, all right, it's the local infection, but how far along has it got?